How's it going, everybody? I'm Jeff Slickey here at the Irv Newhouse building in downtown Olympia with State Senator Drew McEwen representing the 35th. How you doing?
Great. Thanks for coming.
First day of session, kind of like the first day back at school, seeing folks you knew, meeting some of the new people, and this is going to be a really interesting session. It's a long session with a new governor. That's been a long time since that happened.
It has, yeah, since I was first elected.
And speaking of, this is a great office here. We're on the third floor, outlooking the Capitol campus here, and I can see all around it some of the history that you've had in the House of Representatives and now as a state senator. It's really cool to know like how much you've been able to help out the folks in the 35th and some of the bills that you've advocated for and turned into law. So it's just a really cool place to see and also know how accessible you are to the people that are just in the 35th, not just a stone's throw away. So what's it look like for you here this session? What are some of the priorities that you want to bring back to the 35th? What are some of the concerns that you're having?
Well, yeah, certainly concerned on what the budget numbers are.
Yeah.
And this isn't a situation where what existed in 2007, 8, 9 when we had the financial crisis. And
right.
I was not in office then, but those budget ramifications lasted for a few years. But what is happening today, again, we have record revenue growth in the state, but yet we find our state budget roughly, depending on how you want to look at it, $8 to $12 billion
Sure.
Upside down. And really what it is, it's in my opinion, it's an overspending. And it's a misuse of one-time money, and that's all those things have come home to roost now. And the example I like to give would be no different than if my wife and I sat down at the end of the year and we're going to make our budget for the new year, and I want to have a Ferrari and she wants a Lamborghini, and yeah, we have an $8 million deficit. That's what's happened in the state of Washington. We've spent so much money and have had this huge wish list, and so now we have a deficit because we can't meet this huge increase in government that's occurred over the years. And, having said that, so that's a concern. I'm energized a bit by Governor-elect Ferguson. He'll be governor here in 2 days. But that he said, he's proposing massive cuts. And that is something, I should say cuts, really reduced spending. Because it's not looking to gut programs. It's like, hey, we've got to slow the growth of government.
Sure.
And I'll give him credit. I mean, I'm on the opposite side of the aisle, but that he's taken that pragmatic look that we cannot continue on this trajectory and be sustainable. It's just not possible. So I'm embracing that. We'll see what happens as we continue through the process here, but that's certainly the biggest challenge we have ahead of us. And, always looking out for the rural economy as well. And oftentimes, and my predecessor, Senator Tim Sheldon, spoke of this often, that the divide that's in the Democrat Party between urban and rural is real. And we still see that today, and that oftentimes policies that might be more fitting in King County do not work in the Mason County parts of the state. So I'm always looking out to protect our interests there.
So when you talk about the spending or the one-time spending, is that still holdovers from when there was the infusions of COVID monies where the government grew in certain aspects and it hasn't been ratcheted back to reflect kind of what's going on now? Whether, I guess an example might be how a lot of companies work remotely, and then everybody kind of bought into that, and now you're seeing a lot of companies trying to get back into the office. So they're trying to kind of, I don't want to say claw back some of the money, but get back to some point before the spending like that? Or?
Well, that's a part of it. COVID relief dollars was a huge part of, when you look at one-time money that came in, but also there was intention by budget writers over the past few biennium in order to satisfy the fringe of their caucuses and of their party, that they instituted policy but didn't pay for it until later years. Those later years are now coming home to roost.
Okay.
And that's a big part of it as well. So they satisfied, in order to maintain their chairmanships or their leadership positions within their caucus. Okay, we're going to pass that policy, but we're not going to fund it for a couple of years, and those couple of years are now.
So kind of like a balloon payment for folks in the real estate if they're sitting there with their houses and they're looking at it that way.
Right.
Now it's time to
it's time to pony up.
Pay the note.
Yep.
You mentioned Governor-elect Ferguson, and in some of his campaign missives out to the public there, he talked a lot about law enforcement and what he was looking at to help either fund or enable communities to get to better law enforcement numbers. In Mason County, it's 0.9 in the sheriff's department at least 0.9 per 1,000. What are some of the other things that you think that might be working off points, ways to find a little consensus at the beginning and build some goodwill and trust between everybody?
Yeah, again, I welcome that increase in our law enforcement. We need to. We're 51st out of 51 jurisdictions, the 50 states plus DC is where that number comes from. And when it comes to the number of law enforcement we have on a per capita basis, and we do need to have more. Is money a factor? Yes, but I'll tell you what the other big factor is. Go talk to our sheriff or a police chief. It is extraordinarily difficult to recruit because law enforcement has been so vilified.
Right.
Money's only going to get you so far. But if we continue to have an environment where this legislature is saying, law enforcement bad, why does a young person want to go into that career? And so we've got to change the culture too, and how we're looking at public safety. And we can't continue to vilify it and expect people to want to go into it. There's no amount of money that'll solve that. So the two of those need to go hand in hand.
What are some of the bills that you have either thought about pre-filing or getting ready to, since we're starting now, to file in for kind of the benefit of those rural workers in Mason County, specifically in the 35th? We know that the average income of those folks is relatively low compared to certain other counties across the state, especially on the west side of the mountains. What are some of the other ways that you can advocate for them and help give them some relief?
Yeah, the biggest part of that are our capital budget dollars, where we can improve the infrastructure, whether it's at the city level or the county level, and you relieve some of the rate burden that is then experienced by, whether it's through property taxes or through utility rates. When we can make those investments into communities from our capital budget, and I'm proud of what we've done over the last decade, and along with my House seat mates, Dan Griffey and Travis Couture. And in my time in office, over $1 billion gone back into the 35th through those types of budgets. Those are things that you can do that have I don't want to say quick, but a relatively short-term impact that have long-term lasting impacts as well that are vitally important. So I'm going to continue to advocate for those things, working well with the city and the county to make sure we get those investment dollars back. And the reality is, the policies I'd like to change are not feasible in this current legislative makeup. So I'm limited in what I can do that's going to institute policy that I believe would make life better in a rural economy. And so for me, it's more about how do we stop things from, stop the bleeding and make sure that we don't have policies that get through that make it even more difficult. And one of them, for example, there's a rent stabilization bill being heard this week. Sounds good on the surface, but economics 101, it doesn't work. And we're seeing that in Seattle tremendously. There was, I forget the exact stats, so forgive me if I'm wrong on this. I think over a 50-year period, there was like a total of 20 legislative pieces that went into law, whether it was from the city or the state, over a 50-year period, whereas in the last 20 years, it's something like 50 have gone into effect. And what you've seen are less people getting housed, rents going up, and you have less new units coming on board because investors are pulling out, saying that this market is too unstable for us, and that is a real concern. And everybody likes to point and say, "Oh, this large corporation, they got the deep pockets." Do they have more resources than a mom and pop? Yeah, typically, but that doesn't mean it's infinite or that it's endless.
Right.
And there comes a point where they're going to say, "No, we're not going to be in that market anymore." And what you see that's having a bigger impact in our local communities are the folks that saved up some money, bought a second property that they rent out, and they're using that to help support their retirement, and all these new things coming down the pipeline. If they're getting capped on what they can charge for rent, and property taxes are going up substantially, and you have insurance increases of 20-30%, which we've seen in the last few years, there comes a breaking point, and mom and dad say, "We're going to sell that rental property," and guess what? It usually gets bought by somebody who's going to live in there, and you've displaced one more renter. And so it's things like that we've got to keep bringing a voice to. And my concern is when we look at all these things, we never stop in the legislature and say, or the majority never stops and says, should we look at maybe why these things have happened and go and fix those? Instead, they're always trying to put a Band-Aid on, and on something that you're not going to stop a severed arm bleeding by putting a Band-Aid on.
Right. Are there things when it comes to those types of, let's go back to the building and the properties in Mason County, for example. You know, you hear a lot about different regulations and how onerous it is to go through permitting and things like that. What at a state level can be done to help alleviate that, or do those mandates come through either county or city government?
Yes. So there's a lot of things that are at the local level that, believe me, you don't want the state getting involved in, right? You know, and those need to be handled at the local level. But what we can look at the state level is that we continue to increase the burden and make it tougher. And so when you look at everything from the Shoreline Management Act to the Growth Management Act to urban growth areas to the energy code, the building code, these are all things that the state has had a direct impact on. And you know, the Growth Management Act was passed in the early 90s. Our state's population at the time was 4 million. And today it's 8 million. And we've never gone back and said, hey, does this work with a population that has doubled since the law was passed? And I'd argue it hasn't in a lot of areas, especially in Kitsap. You know, and so, but there's this huge reluctance in the legislature to tackle that. But that is a real part of the issue. And, you know, I think, is it fair to say that, you know, for those of us that live in Mason County, we love the rural lifestyle. It's one of the reasons we're there, right? One of the things we have through all that, though, in many areas, you can only have one home per 5 acres. Does that still make sense today? Yeah, and when we have a population that's doubled over the last 30 years. I think we need to take a hard look at that and give more of that control to local units of government as opposed to a top-down management. But then again, you look at how the energy code has changed just in the last few years. It's added roughly $30,000 to $40,000 to a cost of building a home. Yeah, that's a fact, and that's tough.
You're in the minority party here in the state Senate, and you know there's the term supermajority, however that works. I think one shy in the Senate, and it is in the House. Democrats have the advantage plus the governorship. What are some of the ways that you can make your voice better heard? You know, sometimes we hear of the theatrics of I'm going to filibuster all night long or stand up here and do this thing or show off this thing. But what are some of the, I guess, more practical ways or effective ways that you can get folks on the other side of the aisle, maybe even some more of the centrists, to get a coalition going and work towards some of these things?
Yeah, you know, there is a time to take a stand and make your arguments and debate a bill well into the wee hours of the morning. At the end of the day, that bill's still going to pass.
Right.
You know, and so for those that are on the right of me politically, you know, well, they think that there's some magic political maneuver or legislative parliamentarian maneuver we can make to stop everything. We don't have that.
Yeah.
You know, and I often get said, well, in Oregon, the Republicans walked out. Well, in Oregon, they have a different threshold for a quorum. Here, it's a simple majority. So if Republicans walked out, Democrats would have free reign and would pass everything.
And still wouldn't have a say.
Yeah. So there's some nuances to how our state governs versus other states. But, you know, being more pragmatic, you know, and how do you get things done and how do you accomplish things from the position of the minority? It comes down to relationships and getting to know people. And it's actually one of the things that I really hope the legislature can get back to that was lost through COVID.
Yeah.
We had a massive turnover in the legislature over the last 5 years. Not completely uncommon, but the number was large in both the House and Senate. And so a lot of relationships that had been there pre-COVID, you know, disappeared because of people coming and going from the legislature. And you had a lot of people get elected during COVID that never even met their colleagues until 2 years later,
right.
You know, when the legislature returned to here. And there's been this absence for, I would argue, 4 years where we haven't had that time to really be together. And I think it's important, you know, the people like to insinuate the smoke-filled back room deal.
Right.
There's something to be said for going out and having dinner together even when you're politically opposed, and you just get to know people on a personal basis.
Sure.
I long for having those days again where the legislature spends more time off campus doing those things. And when you nurture those relationships and people get to understand, I mean, I often will criticize Seattle, as you know, but you know, at the end of the day, more than half of our state's residents live there, and they've chosen that, you know, and it's important for me to understand, you know, why they view things the way they do, just as it's important for them to understand how the constituency I represent views things. And it goes both ways. And so the more that we can do that, I think the better it is for both parties, regardless of who's in control.
We've heard those stories too. I mean, I guess current, but soon to be former President Biden, when he was a senator, would take the train in Delaware and he'd, ride with his Republican counterparts. Or when I have had a chance to interview Congressman Kilmer, he would bring his Republican counterparts out here and show off what we have to offer here. And yeah, I mean, that does always make sense. A team, team building exercises, things like that. Maybe you guys can get a softball or a hockey team together and play
I'm all for
like.
hockey.
I know you are. I know you are. It's going to be a long session. There's going to be lots of opportunities for us to connect with Senator Drew McEwen here in the 35th. If you have questions, of course, send them to me and I'll get them out to him. He's always more than willing also to answer through his legislative aides and through his website, and I'll put the links to that in the show notes. But here, as we get session underway, very exciting with a lot of new moving parts here in the state capitol. With Senator Drew McEwen, I'm Jeff Slakey. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.